Hello everyone, this is a more unscripted, laid-back video on my thoughts on Warhammer 9th edition so far. Obviously these opinions are subject to change, and they're probably going to inform us about more rules as we go along. This is what I think of the rules as of the 15th of June. Alright, let's start with the things that I like so far about 9th edition. The new command phase is a really good idea because it will help clear up rules, and it also adds in the ability to generate CP every turn. Generating only one CP every turn isn't too significant, but it does allow for you to use stratagems later into the game, whereas typically you'd run out of command points within the first 3 turns or so. A new app is being released for Warhammer 40k, which allows you to check up on the datasheets of any model, which is really good, because this is what Sigmar had for the entire of last edition, and it's something that 40k really should have had earlier, but now we're getting it, so that's great. Another thing they're doing is adding more core stratagems. The one they showed was okay. It gives you a few mortal wounds depending on what engagement range is and how big the squad is, but it seems that they're at least somewhat impactful. They suggested they were going to be encouraging melee with more of the core stratagem, so hopefully there's at least one other that gives a bonus towards that. Next thing I like is the secondary objective system, where you're choosing your objectives. This is much more similar to the ITC system, so you won't actually have to be relying on card draw in order to be scoring points, which is a much better way of doing it. Another thing I like is blast weapons. Getting consistent ways of dealing with hordes is something that you should have. I'd prefer it to something like flamethrowers had blast rules as well, but I don't think we're getting that. What we do know is grenades are getting that, so that will make grenades significantly more impactful. The terrain rework, I'm a bit mixed on. I like the fact that they're introducing more keywords, but the way that it's currently set up, you end up with weird cases like the Triumph of St. Catherine being able to be seen through obscuring objects, which is not something I'm a huge fan of. I do like the fact that they are categorizing pieces of terrain. We're going to have to see as we go along whether or not the terrain is working as intended, but so far I'm hopeful and optimistic about it. Next up is the change to strategic reserves, which now cost CP. Whenever I refer to something as deep strike, that's what I mean by strategic reserves. This is really good if there's other ways of melee being more viable, like transports or foot slogging. Hopefully the terrain rework will help that. Next up is the aircraft change, which once again is a bit mixed. It doesn't seem they really changed too much about aircraft, other than the fact they can no longer fly off the board. The fact that they could fly off the board was kind of insignificant, but it allows your bombers to go in straight lines and actually hit good bombing runs without the fear of falling off the board. They've added a CP cost to souping armies, which is really good. I believe that unit flexibility should cost tactical flexibility, and that appears to be the case, which is really nice. Always sitting on 6s, which is not something that's really going to be coming into effect in this edition, but it's something that should have been there to begin with, but I like the fact that it is there. Hitting things on second floors is something they also haven't discussed yet, but that's something that should have been there to begin with, but it's here now, so that's great. Changes to morale are really nice, because that means that we are getting more effects of leadership, meaning that lower leadership units are going to have more leadership mitigation things, which hopefully should make the leadership mitigation units much better. You might actually start seeing commissars to support regular infantry squads and stuff like that. They also suggested that there's going to be an attrition system, so battles that go on longer will require more leadership mitigation. And finally, tanks shooting into combat. This was something I thought I would hate, because I thought the tanks could just shoot out at combat at whatever they like. But instead what's happened is it's made weapons like flamethrowers that are close range that you wouldn't typically put on a vehicle. They're now much more useful because they protect it when it's in melee, because the only thing you can do is shoot into the combat that you're in with a tank. Obviously this doesn't really affect that many units. It only really seems to affect Old Marines, Guard, and Orcs off the top of my head. Now we're going to move on to the things I don't like. This list is actually quite short. We'll start with a new logo. It looks flat and ugly. I think everyone feels this way about the new logo, but we're probably going to get used to it as time goes on. Next up is the change to command points. Some people are going to say, well, the old previous version really restricted your lists. You always had to bring so many troops. It'd always be like 2 battalions and a specialist detachment. But instead what's going to happen here is we're just going to have everyone cramming everything into one detachment. Because every detachment that doesn't contain your warlord costs CP, why would you ever create detachments that don't include your warlord? You can fit a pretty sizable army inside of just one battalion, so I don't see why you'd ever try to do more than that. There's only so many troops you even realistically want to bring, just enough to hold objectives. The next thing is that there's no matched play rules for armies of larger than 3,000 points. Now you might be saying, why are you playing a match played game with over 3,000 points? And the simple answer is because narrative and open rules kinda suck because of being able to spam generate command points, stuff like that. It just makes the game not particularly fun, and I'd like to be able to play with proper rules for a large game size, even if it isn't as balanced. The next thing I don't like is the points increase. I don't mind it if it's balanced properly, because it allows you to separate things like conscripts and infantry squads, which currently cost the same amount of points, when really the conscripts should cost less than infantry squads because they're pretty much worse across the board. By the looks of it though, the current way they're setting it up, it just looks like they're going to screw over hordes. The two things they gave us show that cultists were going up by 50%, whereas intercessors are going up by 17%. If you haven't noticed, 50% is a much larger amount than 17%. So the cultists are probably going to be completely unviable, unless of course Chaos Space Marines are ridiculously expensive as well. The final thing I'm not such a huge fan on is the limiting the plus and minuses to 1. The larger problem with pluses and minuses to hit are armies that get minuses to hit across the board, or armies that get significant amount of minuses off of stratagems and stuff. Like flyers being -1 to hit is completely fine, I don't think that's a huge deal, but when you have things like a Latok and a Raven Guard that get -1 to hit across the entire army, it just makes it ridiculously hard for anyone with a bad ballistic skill to even hit them. If you think about just the dice rolls, it's the same as adding 1 to the save. You'll never see an army that has +1 to its save across the board because that would be overpowered. So I don't see why you have -1 to hit across an entire army. I feel like if you have an effect like that, it should be limited to specific units in order to make the entire army a bit less tanky. And finally, we're going to move on to things that I want to happen that probably aren't going to happen. I'd like to see a general reduction in RNG. I know it's a dice rolling game and RNG is inherently part of it, but I'd like it to be rewarding for people to play tactically. Currently there's so many stratagems and effects that go off on a dice roll even though they should be guaranteed, and they can completely change the tide of the game. Probably one of the most egregious examples of that is Agents of Vect, where 1/3 of the time, it can completely change the tide of the game, and 2/3 of the time, it's a balanced stratagem. I don't like stratagems that just do that 1/3 of the time. It's so stupid and silly. I definitely feel like when you are using a stratagem, you should get a guaranteed effect. The other thing I don't like is D6 shots or D6 damage. Unless you're rolling a ton of dice so that the averages work out, it's just not very fun for the person that's trying to roll for the heavy flamer and only gets 1 shot. I feel like these things need to have minimum values, like the Onajig Dune Crawler's D6 minimum 3 damage. That should be applied to pretty much any D6 damage weapon. The next thing I want to see gone is bad stratagems. In fact, I just want to reduce the number of stratagems in general. It's not fun to leaf through 3 or 4 pages of useless stratagems that are incredibly niche and should just be put on the unit's profile just to get to the 1 or 2 good ones that I know I'm going to need to use. Yeah, I could cut them out or put them in an insert or something, but it's just a bit silly. I just want to see most of them gone. I don't want to say that I don't want to do any thinking while playing the game, obviously, but I don't want to have to look through the pages of useless stratagems just to get to the ones that are good. Or have so ridiculously overly situational ones that I'm going to forget them because the situations they come up are so rare. The next thing I'd like to see is better inter- and intra-faction balancing. Basically, units within a faction should be better balanced compared to each other, and each faction should be more balanced compared to each other. Because in 8th edition, we had a dominant knight meta, followed up by Eldar flyer shenanigans, followed by more Imperial Knights, and finally finished off with just Space Marine spam. And I'd like to see more interesting results in tournaments. It's not to say that friendly games don't still work, but I would like to see, one person not bring a large amount of competitive units and just completely wipe the floor to the person that was like, I bought these models because they look cool. The biggest thing I'd like to see changed that I know is not going to be changed, but I can live in the eternal hope that it will, is a change to the AP system. So the best weapons in the game currently have middling strength, high AP, and D3 or 2 damage. This is because they are effective against pretty much everything in the game, and this is all down to the AP. Because you can shoot your anti-infantry guns at tanks, if it carries any amount of AP, it can shred right through that tank's armor, seeing as so many tanks don't have invuln saves. The tanks that do have invuln saves tend to be pretty OP, but it's not very fun for a person shooting their anti-tank weapons to get their shots resisted most of the time. Personally, the way I would like to see it done is to have, for every point of toughness the target has over the weapon's strength, you lose a point of AP. So for example, if you're shooting a strength 4 weapon with -3 AP at a toughness 7 vehicle, you'd get no AP. But if you were to shoot a strength 7 weapon at a toughness 7 vehicle, you would get your normal amount of AP. This way, it encourages you to pick your targets better, and you can't just spam high AP stuff and, hope for the best. It means there's no longer such a big requirement on the toughness 8 threshold, and it also means you can introduce more AP on lower strength weapons, and it also means that you don't have to give everything stupid invuln saves just to make it survive. Alright, that was a long one. Let's go on to a nice short one. Improvements to single shot weapons. The Vanquish cannon has been terrible for long enough. Please make single shot weapons slightly better. It's difficult to do without templates, I'll give you that. But I'd like to see some sort of buff to rerolls to hits or something for something that only shoots a single shot. Alternatively, just increase the number of shots. I don't know. But I'd like to see weapons like that be better. Another thing I'd like to see is getting rid of old rules, and I hope that as the codexes come out, they just nullify the old rules. I know where as it currently stands, you don't want to just tell people you can't use your old books, because it's not particularly fun to have spent all the money on that, only for the rules to be made completely null and void. But overall, I'd like to not have to take 7 books wherever I go. I'd rather just have to bring my codex and maybe the core rules. I'd like to see power level going away, because currently it is pretty much useless. The only time I think it is useful is for crunching down the words on a stratagem. So it says if a unit is over 18 power level, it can't have the stratagem affected by it, but you can still do that with the points equivalent. Another thing I'd like to see that's probably not going to happen is an ally system, as it were, so I can actually play 2v2s with proper rules, because currently the game is pretty much based around 1v1s, which is, to be fair, the proper way you're supposed to play match play. But at the same time, I want to be able to play with my friends who don't necessarily play the same armies of me. Quite a few games I played in 8th were 2v2s with my friends, because not all of them play Orcs or Guard. I'd like to be able to do that with proper rules supporting it as well. And finally, I'd like to see Marines being crunched down. Currently, there is so many Marine models, I honestly feel kind of sorry for the Marines. What with even more releases around the board, they're going to end up with such an abundance of units that it's going to be hard to keep track of all of them. So, here's my suggestion. You take any similar units, like Tactical Marines and Intercessors, or, for example, the new Melter Marines and Devastator Marines, and you crunch them together into one unit. I feel like this is probably the best way of compromising between old and new Marine players. Because obviously you won't be able to get all the equipments in the old boxes. If you want to run any of the new equipment, you'd have to buy the new models. And if you want to use your old models, they're still viable. Because currently as it stands, old Marine stuff just generally doesn't stand up to the new Marine stuff. And honestly, if they're going to phase out old Marines, I think this is also probably one of the best ways of doing it. While I was editing this video, they released a bunch of new rules to do with 9th edition. So let's start with Overwatch. They've killed it. Overwatch is gone. It's dead. It now has a single CP stratagem, which means that you only get to Overwatch once in the charge phase. This is absolutely crazy good for melee armies. There's also been a change to melee as listed in the faction focus of Adeptus Sororitas. Now you cannot multi-charge unless you make the charge roll successfully to all targets of the charge. Okay, big buffs and nerfs on both sides. I think these are both really good rule changes, although we'll have to see how Overwatch plays out. It's never been tried before to this extreme extent. So, all I can say is I'm sorry Tau players. Anyway, I think that's all I've got to say on my thoughts on 9th. I'd like to thank you for listening. Thank you for getting me to over 5,000 subscribers. Absolutely insane. I'd like to thank each and every one of you just for being here and watching my videos. If you enjoyed this video or enjoy videos like this, feel free to drop a subscription. I'd really appreciate that. Or leave a like and drop a comment to contribute to the discussion. And once again, thank you for watching the video.